Meow! Huples cat, is your town or city one of the best places to live in the world? Mine is. Let's have a look at Livability Index. It actually has some applications to GridDown. Not many, but some. So The Economist has an intelligence unit, the EIU, and they rank 140 world cities in terms of livability, based predominantly on things like access to healthcare. Now, before you start screening, they also take into account private healthcare accessibility for the population. So that alone actually makes America very difficult to get into the top 10. But other countries with public health service have a really easy time getting in if they tick the other boxes. Now, the undisputed champion of the world in terms of livability is Vienna in Austria, and that's pretty cool. It keeps winning. Their score was 99.1 out of 100 this year, and they look at 5 separate categories. The categories they look at are the city's stability, both in terms of economy and government. Culture, is the culture available? The environment, parks, water, air. Air is becoming an increasingly problematic issue for a lot of these cities, with air pollution getting worse and worse and worse. Education and infrastructure and healthcare. So yeah, that's pretty good news. If you live in one of these cities, it means if you're not happy there, you're not going to be happy anywhere, I guess. But in terms of GridDown, I think this is a really important way of looking at things. When we look for a bug out location, or we look at our home for bug in, we tend to look at these things as well, but maybe not quite as intelligently as the Economist's intelligence unit does. Maybe we probably should. Now, they do mention that most American, United States cities don't get in because of 2 factors. High crime rate, which is a factor for whatever reasons, and it's not really being dealt with properly for whatever reason, though it is on the decline as it is everywhere, but America's not declining quite as rapidly as everywhere else. And also poor infrastructure, and I think this is a really key thing. And you don't necessarily have to have multiple subways either to do this. They're looking at water supply, they're looking at parks, sidewalks, electricity generation, they're looking at a whole bunch of different issues. Probably all of you have been to New York. New York City actually rated 58th. And they do point out it's harder for bigger cities to get in because of various structural reasons. But Tokyo managed to get in, and congratulations to Tokyo. Tokyo is one of the top 10 places in the world to live. It is of course interesting that they say big cities have a hard time getting in, but fail to realise that Toronto is actually a mega city. It's bigger than Chicago now in terms of population, and still of course growing. But 3 of the top 10 cities are actually in Canada. Calgary, Vancouver and good old Toronto. And I would say that's true. Toronto's a very livable city. You need a fair amount of income, but it's actually fairly easy to get a small amount of income and do reasonably well in Toronto. There's an awful lot of free things to do and an awful lot of park space and public areas, if you can get over the winters. And out of interest, the top Canadian city was Calgary, and that was 97.5. Vancouver was 6 with 97.3, and Toronto was a tie, 97.2. And in fact, out of the top 3, Vienna's number 1, and then Melbourne and Sydney, Australia. Pretty cool, eh? So any score of 80 to 100 is actually a great place to live. And anything 50 or less is actually a very, very bad place to live. And I think that's important. If you're relocating, it's a nice idea to have a good idea of what the livability index is for each city. For example, if you were relocating to Canada and you had options of various cities, like you might pick Montreal over Toronto, either due to language, in which case you probably would have a better time there if you spoke only French. But you might actually pick Montreal because you perceive it to be smaller and more old worldly and all the rest of it. But if you actually want to live and have a great time, Toronto will be better a place for you to go than Montreal. And of course, Calgary is the best place in Canada to live, apparently. And I'm sure a lot of Albertans would agree with that. And I think it's interesting with all the negativity about the oil patch and stuff that Calgary still retains the ability to be the most livable place to live in the entirety of North America. Now this is all well and good. Of course, anytime somebody like The Economist magazine tells me that my city is one of the top places to live in the world, It's national pride and civic pride and all the rest of it. But there's other stuff in this report that's actually somewhat important. Yes, it gives you the 10 most livable cities in the world, and it talks about why they're that way, and it talks about a lot of other issues. The Economist is a good source of statistical analysis, and the more information we have, the more we're able to actually make strategic and long-term and short-term plans that could help us possibly cope with a major shtf GridDown event. Possibly. It's one of many sources of information I look to when I make my decisions. But let's have a look at this. So they also look at the 10 cities that are the worst places at all on the planet to live. And there's not much surprise there. However, which 5 cities have shown the biggest decline in livability? Which 5? Well, as you can see, no surprises there, but maybe you didn't realize just how badly off Detroit is now. How urgent is the need for America to actually help Detroit stop its slide into becoming one of the less developed places on the planet. Now that may sound a bit extreme, but honestly, in GridDown, if you're in Detroit, it's already suffering massive issues with falling quality and quantity of life. That's not a great place to be in GridDown. You wouldn't want to be in Caracas, I guess. You wouldn't want to be in Detroit either. One of the many interesting facts that they give you in this report is which 5 cities have actually shown the most improvements over the last year and where their relative rankings are. I think this may be a little bit of a surprise to most of us. The trend's really important. Moscow, Belgrade, Hanoi, Kiev and Azerbaijan are actually improving. Now they're not doing great. The only country there that's a quote a great place to live is Moscow, because that's its overall rating is 80 and the 100's ideal, but 80 to 100 is a pretty nice place to live. But as you can see, if you live in a really bad area but it's improving, that's going to give you more resilience over time than in an area that's got an okay rating that's dropping. So I think that's an important thing to think about. So what's the message for this from GridDown? Well, they have 5 major categories. Stability. There may be stability after the fall depending on what causes it in the local area. So stability is going to be very local in effect, and I'm talking here 5 to 10 miles. If you've got a bunch of thugs who are living like 5 to 10 miles away from you, your security is going to be pretty unstable. What you won't have probably is the police and the army and even neighbours who are actually going to look out for you. So stability is going to be an issue. Now I think for a lot of preppers the way we deal with stability is we retreat away from people and arm ourselves and protect ourselves from attacks. So stability is something you want to look at. Is your area actually defensible? A lot of people buy bug out locations that are scrubland or desert land without any growing or water potential, or even worse, they retreat into high mountain areas of the United States, which is all well and good, but you can't really grow food and you won't really be able to hunt your food given the number of people in the area with guns. So your stability there is actually going to be not just the security issue, you know, how close you are to a major city, all of that stuff, but the stability issue is, can you be stable there? Can you produce things there that will keep you in that area in reasonable security and comfort over the period of the SHTF, which of course might last decades or centuries. So what about healthcare? Accessibility and affordability to healthcare is one of their main criteria. It's why socialist countries are doing so well in the index. They do allow for the fact there is private healthcare and they do rate that, but part of the rating is, does it cover most of the people or all of the people in that city? And obviously private healthcare never will and never does. So that dampens down America's livability index. And of course, if you don't require free healthcare, you're not going to rate your city as low as the Economist is going to do. But if you need healthcare, you might rate it worse. But in SHTF healthcare, there won't be any ambulances, there won't be any clinics, there won't be any doctors, there won't be any hospitals, and there may not be very many nurses. Of course, depending on what the event is. If it's a pandemic, there will be substantial destruction of personnel in healthcare, and I hope I'm retired from that before that happens, because I'm a nurse and so's Kitty. But any SHTF is going to affect the cities probably worse than rural areas. Most of the healthcare personnel and hospitals and infrastructure are inside of cities or on the outskirts. So you can expect that there won't be ambulances and there won't be clinics and there won't be vaccinations and there won't be any of that stuff anymore. So to make your bug out location or your bug in location more livable, one of the things you need to do is to provide a degree of healthcare. Now I keep hammering home this point. Carrying 2 or 3 Israeli bandages is not healthcare. You need to be able to provide sanitation, you need to be able to provide clean water, you need to be able to provide it easily, reliably and safely. You need to be able to understand quarantining, you need to understand how to take a temperature, how to check people's respirations and abdomen for issues, how to treat basic infectious diseases, all of that stuff. One of my plans is to actually provide an open, free healthcare clinic in my local area as soon as it's safe to do so. I won't be doing any of that whilst the event is unfolding and whilst the area is violent and unsafe. But once it starts to settle down, as soon as I feel reasonable, I'm going to open a clinic and it's going to be free to all. I would expect bartering. I would expect people to help me out if they're coming for my treatments, but I do expect that part of helping the community develop and become more stable and more livable will be to provide some effect of limited healthcare that has now been removed. I think that's an important thing, and I don't see why a lot of these mag groups with 10, 20, 30 people in it aren't really focusing on what they can do to make their own community, not their group, but the community that live around them, much more livable and safe. I think a lot of them aren't doing that, and I think that's a pity, and I also think it could be a mistake for longevity in GridDown. Well, culture is often overlooked, and it's not overlooked for me. I do think culture is important. I like reading and I like music and all that stuff, and I think putting aside some ability to do that's good. I think it would be nice in the spring or the fall of GridDown to celebrate with your local community events and days and potlucks and all of that stuff. I think that's an important thing to think about, but it's really not going to get going on a community level for quite some time. But you know, depending on what the event is, Kitty might start providing free yoga classes and stuff like that, and I might start doing some teaching and things like that. We can do things that we can, not just for ourselves but for others around us, that would improve the culture of the area. Now the one biggie is environment. Now obviously if it's not like nuclear war followed by nuclear winter, the environment's going to be toast for a long time, years, 3 or 4 or 5 years, it's going to be toast. So to survive in that situation, livability is not, it's survivability. However, if you survive and get through that, livability becomes an issue. So look at all the water sources in your area. Where do they come from? Are there any big cities? Are there any waste dumps? Are there any industrial plants upstream from you? That will affect your environment's livability in a post-SHTF environment dramatically. Are there any nuclear plants upwind or close to you within 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 miles? That again, in a global collapse, will dramatically affect your environment. So all of those things you need to be thinking about. Is the environment able to produce food in large quantities relatively easily? Or is it just a tiny piece of soil on top of a mountain top that's covered in trees? It's great for security and stability, but if you can't feed yourself there, you're toast. A lot of the areas around Toronto were stripped of trees, and farmers went in there in the 19th century and made nice farms, and after 5 years they all failed because the soil was this deep and it was only on sand, and it all just washed away. The trees were holding this in place, so of course now the councils have put trees up all over those areas and restabilised them, and it makes the area around where I live beautiful, which is why Toronto's a livable city. Now I did mention education. Now I just want to say straight off, there is no difference in the education between a boy and a girl, and anybody out there that is intending to restrict education for girls based upon the Bible or the Quran or the Korah or whatever religious mumbo jumbo you believe in, you're an evil person. Women are people, and people deserve to be educated. So what does this mean in a GridDown situation? Well, there won't be any schools and there won't be any internet, and books may well be burned depending on what it is for heating. So part of my healthcare clinic is that I would actually structure it so we would half a day a week to start with, once it's safe, open the doors for K1 through 21. I'm a university professor. I will be teaching global health again this semester, I found out today, and the class starts on Tuesday. So yeah, they give me like 4 days notice, but whatever. So I have the skills for that, and there won't be much demand for that during the SHTF during the fall, but it's important for your local community to start learning children to read, write and do arithmetic very early on, because we will lose society for sure, but we can also lose civilization, and that would be the bigger loss in the long term. You've got to survive, you've got to thrive, and you've got to take some personal responsibility as a prepper. If you manage that and luck is required, you've then got to take responsibility for helping make civilization start again. We require civilization to live our lives. It's a comfortable thing. Now you can change the structure of civilization, and I will be, in a more socialized way if I can, and you might want to do it in a more religious way or a more military way, I don't care. But a civilization is required for progress, and without scientific and cultural and human progress, very much point surviving. If 1,000 years after SHTF, what's left of humanity is wandering around with spears trying to kill 12-foot long mutant cats, and with no progress of ever again to happen, it's a bit pointless. Now infrastructure is critical. The ability to move around easily and all that stuff is absolutely critical in our modern world. It won't be as critical in a GridDown situation, but I think a lot of people don't realise just how damaged the roads are going to become quite early on, especially in areas like Toronto with the winters that we have and the streams that are under the ground. All of that infrastructure will not be replaced or repaired for a period of months to years to decades. There was a time if you needed a barn, you got your neighbours together and fed them, and you built a barn together. And that's what we're going back to. Now obviously we have technology, we have brains, and some of us are prepping. So it shouldn't go back to the 17th century or the 18th century or even the 19th century for everything. We live in the 21st century, and even after SHTF, we can use 20th century technology and brains to actually make our infrastructure feasible. But infrastructure is going to be a lot different. It's going to be really difficult for those of you who are car dependent. And people out there are so car dependent, they practice bug outs by car. They can't conceive of the fact the road may be impassable, or the gasoline may not be there, or that they may not be safe to be driving in a car. Because especially if you live in an area with lots of guns, if nobody can drive and you've managed to save the gasoline and you're driving around in a car, there is a good chance that people might start shooting at you or putting trees down on the roads. I would not assume the road's going to be passable in very early SHTF, either through congestion or for preppers chopping trees down to block people's access to rural areas. I think those two things are extremely likely, but it's not going to take more than one winter for a lot of the main roads and a lot of the minor roads to be undermined so badly you're not going to get through even in a Jeep or a big fancy new $70,000 truck. You're going to be back on your feet. If you're smart and you can, you're going to be on horseback, at least initially. But what we need to do is actually make sure the dams are repaired, make sure dams are fortified. We need to look at our infrastructure in terms of not having modern society, because it's a critical point to having a livable society. Well, that's it for me. I enjoyed reading that report. You can get it if you register online and stuff like that, they'll send it to you. And I consider stuff like that worth the risk for OPSEC, because honestly I do. I think there's a lot of paranoia out there. And I think a large part of the prepper paranoia is actually causing us not to prepare in ways that will make our local communities livable post-SHTF. And I think that's a huge error. Because remember, in SHTF, tomorrow will always be worse than today, unless you prep. And part of prepping is to make your own community livable and resilient in GridDown. Not just your prepper group, but your community, the people who live a couple of miles, 5 miles away from you. They're going to be your brothers and sisters. They might be your worst nightmare and your worst enemies. But again, if it's a livable place, they will be like brothers and sisters to you. You will care immensely about the farm 3 houses over, because they produce most of your potatoes or carrots. It's going to be very integrated and very local. And I think it's about time preppers started thinking long term rather than just short term, because most global SACFs will be long term events. Doodles.